The 30th annual Alaska Native Art Auction, celebrating Indigenous artists and voices, takes place Saturday, March 21st at the Hotel Captain Cook in Anchorage. Information available at knba.org. The Alaska Native Art Auction Gala is March 21st, 2026 in Anchorage, Alaska. Donate artwork by February 27th, 2026 and be eligible to win $500. Help sustain Indigenous-led media, including National Native News. Donor forms and details are found at knba.org.
Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. Tribes are coming to grips with the loss of more than $1.5 billion in federal funding previously promised to them, mainly through clean energy development and manufacturing contracts. A new analysis by the Brookings Institution connects that funding to a pattern of disinvestment by the federal government and gives rise to a new level of unpredictability in the relationship between the government and tribes. We'll hear about the implications coming up after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. The federal government is encouraging tribes to partner with data centers. That could mean leasing land or, as the Mountain West News Bureau's Hannah Merzbach reports, selling power.
At a U.S. Department of Energy webinar, Ken Ahman with Colusa Indian Energy said that's where the big bucks come in.
Potentially billions of dollars into the coffers of tribes.
His company provides energy infrastructure to data centers on tribal land. He says these partnerships can be good for tribes that have land and resources to power big projects, like the Osage Nation in Oklahoma. Paul Beemore is the chair of the tribe's utility board.
Tribes that are casino dependent really need to look at other ways to build their economies, and I think that data centers is one of those opportunities.
Though Beemore says people may be wary about how this will impact the environment. Other tribes have expressed concerns about data centers draining precious water supplies. For National Native News, I'm Hannah Merzbach.
Disney's animated film, Moana 2, has been translated into Hawaiian, just like the first movie. Hawaii Public Radio's Cassie Ordonio reports.
Most Disney productions are dubbed in more than 40 languages after appearing in English. The Moana series is one of them. The sequel made history with a global debut on Disney Plus this month, marking the beginning of Mahina Olelo Hawaii, or Hawaiian Language Month. Laiana Kanoa Wong is a member of the Moana 2 Oceanic Cultural Trust.
Things that you could find on the media or in shows, we didn't have it. We were watching every cartoon you could imagine at the time. We were watching all of these things, but nothing ever looked and sounded like us. And so being able to be a part of this project was a huge honor and privilege.
Kanoa Wong was honored to be a part of the project and to see the characters brought to life in Olelo, Hawaii.
It was important to make sure that the Maoli Hawaii was still strong, like the essence and what we were trying to say was still strong. Even if sometimes it didn't match perfectly with the lip flap, we forgave ourselves sometimes if it conveyed the meaning and it was helpful for that purpose. Sometimes like we would have written it out and we're like, oh, we got to add a few more things. Or why don't we add this word or these sounds that can also deepen the meaning, but from a Hawaiian worldview.
Moana 2 tells the story of the Polynesian princess receiving a call from her wayfinding ancestors. She embarks on a dangerous journey across the ocean. She reunites with Maui and recruits other characters from her home in Motunui to join her. The Hawaiian language version of the film is produced by an all-local cast, including the original Moana voice actress Auli'i Cruvalho. The character Loto is voiced by Native Hawaiian actress Pualelea Panaeva.
For me, it was a very special opportunity to be able to voice a character in such a beloved Disney film series. Moana is huge, not just amongst like our people too, like not just amongst Hawaiians or Polynesians or Oceania, like in the world.
For National Native News, I'm Cassie Ordonio.
Jim Gray, former principal chief of the Osage Nation, is being remembered for his leadership and advocacy for Indian country. He passed away last week at age 64. Chairperson Ben Barnes of the United Indian Nations of Oklahoma says Gray's achievements for his tribe and Indian country have left a profound impact, including modernizing the Osage Nation's government by ratifying its first constitution and securing equal voting rights for every Osage member. The National Congress of American Indians President Mark McCarl says Gray devoted his life to strengthening the Osage Nation and advancing tribal sovereignty. Funeral services are being held on Monday. I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support by the Gathering of Nations Powwow. The last dance is this April 24th and 25th at Expo, New Mexico. Gone's last horse rider and regalia parade takes place at 4 p.m. both days. Tickets at gatheringofnations.com and at the gates.
Hear that? Tribal college faculty do so much, one can't say it all here. Nothing but respect. Visit mostthorough.jobdescription.com. The American Indian College Fund supports this program.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. By rescinding $1.5 billion from tribes, the federal government perpetuates a pattern of neglect and skirts its responsibility. That is a conclusion in a new months-long analysis by the Brookings Institution. They also say the disinvestment in tribal clean energy programs and manufacturing contracts worsens the problem of climate change that disproportionately harms indigenous people around the globe. Much of what Congress and the Trump administration took back was money promised to tribes in the Bipartisan Inflation Reduction Act during the Biden era. Brookings researchers also looked at how funding takebacks are affecting Native participation in SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and Medicaid. We'll hear about that and get a perspective on the Trump administration's decision to repeal the country's landmark climate policy. Listeners, you can join us today. The number is 1-800-996-2848 or just 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now on Zoom from Washington, D.C., we have Robert Maxim. He is a fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he is Mashpee Wampanoag. Robert, hello, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Waniksuk, Sean. It's great to be with you.
Great to have you. Joining us from Hutchinson Island, Florida, we have Sherry Smith. She is the president and CEO of the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy, and she is a Mi'kmaq descendant. Sherry, welcome back to Native America Calling to you also.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having us.
Joining us from the Hopi Reservation is Timothy Nuvangyauma. He is the Vice President of Tribal Engagement for the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy, and he is also a former chairman of the Hopi Tribe. Tim, good morning, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Oui, Lolo Mahapi. Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having us this morning.
Absolutely. And joining us from Ann Arbor, Michigan, we have Dr. Kyle White, a professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. He is a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Kyle, you've also been on the show. Welcome back.
Great. Bonjour, Sean. Good to be here.
It's good to have all of you on this show today. I'm excited about this conversation. And Robert, I want to begin with you. When Congress passed the Big Beautiful Bill Act last summer, it removed various clean energy investments previously promised to tribes. What are these lost investments?
Yeah, so the One Beautiful Bill Act, and we mentioned this a bit into the show lead, is really going to result in a net loss of funding for Indian country through two main channels. The first is this rescission of federal climate funding, and then the second is the implementation of new work requirements for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Programs of SNAP or food stamps and Medicaid. And our analysis looked at the lifetime of the Biden administration's One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and have found that the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act. And what our analysis found is if the IRA had been allowed to stay in effect and had not been partially rescinded by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, it would have resulted in about $3.5 billion flowing to Indian country for climate investment. And that's quite close to what the Biden administration initially envisioned when the Inflation Reduction Act passed. About $2 billion of that funding has already made it to Indian country, or at least been obligated to Indian country. Not all the cash has made it through. We could talk about that if you'd like. And what our analysis finds is because the One Big Beautiful Bill Act rescinds these climate programs that were created through the Inflation Reduction Act, Indian country is not going to see that remaining $1.5 billion. And so, the state of play now is some funding may still be flowing to Indian country for projects that exist, but others is going to be clawed back entirely. And so I think that's going to be a real challenge for tribes.
Okay, now this $1.5 billion that was initially promised to tribes, is that money to improve clean energy infrastructure, or are these contracts that enable tribes to benefit financially?
Yeah, it's both, but I should actually clarify because I think this is an important point. So our data actually shows that most of the climate funding that went to Indian country through the Inflation Reduction Act didn't come from tribal specific programs, but rather from general competitive grant programs that tribes and native entities needed to apply to. And so I think that's a really important point for folks to understand, because Congress currently, the way they talk about it is they're saying, well, we preserved a lot of the programs that are supporting Indian country. So programs like the Tribal Climate Resilience Program or the Tribal Electrification Program, those programs got left alone by Congress. But our analysis found that less than 15% of climate funding that went to Indian country through the Inflation Reduction Act came through those tribal specific programs. About 2/3 of the funding came through much larger programs that were available to all communities in the US, and entities in Indian country needed to apply to them. So I just think that's an important distinction, and it shows how even if Congress is on paper paying lip service to trust and treaty obligations, in practice, they're still significantly impacting a lot of the funding to tribal communities.
Okay. Robert, give us a more clear picture of where that $1.5 billion would go. Give us some examples, perhaps, of programs or other projects.
Yeah, and I don't want to name specific tribal programs just because of data sovereignty issues, but I can talk about some of the types of programs that were supported here. So think about enhancement of solar capacity on reservations. There are a lot of tribes that still rely on fossil fuels and extraction in a variety of different capacities. That not only impacts the climate, but it has really significant negative impacts in areas like water and soil contamination for Native people. Things like oil spills and other contaminants that have downstream health impacts, things like increasing the prevalence of cancer on certain reservations and tribal communities. And then you also see awards that have been doing things like restoring eroded shorelines for coastal tribes, providing workforce development in communities, not only in the clean energy sector, but across broader tribal economies. And then doing things like rebuilding roads and bridges to connect folks on reservation to opportunities off and vice versa. So this funding was really going to a broad array of different uses, and much of that's now at risk.
Okay. Now, Robert, the Inflation Reduction Act, originally this was intended as a way for Congress and President Biden to work together as a response to the economic impact, the harm done by the COVID pandemic. And at the time, it was, in all fairness, a significant increase in what tribes could previously count on from the federal government. Is there any way, in looking at it like, hey, we're just going back to what tribes could ordinarily expect in federal funding without the Inflation Reduction Act and that big boost of federal funding? Is that a fair question to ask?
Yeah, I think that's one way to look at it. I just think there's two issues with thinking about it that way. The first is the climate crisis is real, whether or not the federal government wants to talk about it that way or not right now. So, whether or not we have this funding, in the absence of it, the climate issues that tribes and the U.S. as a whole face aren't going to mitigate. They are likely going to accelerate, right? So that's the first challenge. The second, though, is historically, and we have some forthcoming research actually at Brookings that's going to show some of this, the level of investment that the federal government was making in the Indian country has been wholly inadequate in many areas. So yes, we might be going back to the pre-Inflation Reduction Act, pre-COVID baseline, but that baseline was way too low. And what we write in the piece is that the cycle of investment in disinvestment that you see with these latest funding cuts is really representative of how the federal government has long provided funding for Indian country. These kind of bursts of funding over a short period, often followed by longer periods of stagnation or even funding cuts. And that presents challenges not only for tribal economics and tribal economy building, but for tribal governance as well.
Mm-hmm. Robert, you mentioned earlier you also looked at SNAP and Medicaid work requirements. Now, it's important to note that Native Americans are exempted from those, but you say the new rules put up potential hurdles for Native Americans. What are those?
Yeah, and you mentioned one of the most you mentioned the work requirements just at a high level, right? So one of the most significant sources of cost savings in the One Big Beautiful Bill comes from these new work requirements. And so, I think it's just important to note that these cost savings, quote unquote, are happening because the bill counts on people getting kicked off coverage. So that in many ways is a feature of the bill, not a bug. And I think our team at Brookings points that out as a problem, right? Now, in a nod to the federal government's trust and treaty obligations, the bill does, like you said, exempt Native Americans from work requirements for both SNAP and Medicaid. So that's great. What's the problem then? As we write in the piece, exempting a group on paper is not the same as exempting them in practice. And so we include several examples of past instances where Native Americans have faced barriers to staying enrolled in Medicaid, and where policies on the state level, like work requirements, have actually resulted in Native people getting kicked off federal programs, and in some cases at the highest rate of any group. And so I'm happy to discuss a couple of those mechanisms if you like. But the important thing is just exempting folks on paper, exempting Native people on paper, isn't enough to actually protect their coverage.
Robert Maxim kicking off our conversation here today on Native America Calling. He is a fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he is helping us understand the rescission of almost $1.5 billion from tribes that was originally promised through the Inflation Reduction Act. And now with the tax and spending bill, also known as the Big Beautiful Bill, that's all going away. So we're going to continue our conversation with Robert and our other guests, and the phone lines are open for anyone who would like to join us. Call us, 1-800-996-2848. Share your insights. Continued weak salmon runs have prompted a federal commission to institute stricter bycatch rules on commercial fishers in Alaska. The action has major implications for both the fishing industry and subsistence harvesters. We'll find out what changes are in store on the next Native America Calling.
Support by the American Indian College Fund. The American Indian College Fund provides millions of dollars of scholarships to thousands of Native students every year. Tribal citizens of every age and experience are eligible. The deadline for applications is May 31st, and you can find everything you need to apply at collegefund.org. That's collegefund.org, or by phone at 800-766-FUND. Education is the answer.
Thanks for tuning in today to Native America Calling. We are checking in on how the government is living up to its trust responsibility when it comes to federal funding. Listeners, you can join this conversation. Call us at 1-800-996-2848. Once again, that number, 1-800-996-2848. Our next guest, Sherry Smith, joins us now. She is the president and CEO of the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. And Sherry, what tribal projects were supported by funds for clean energy?
Sean, thank you for having us. So many tribal projects, from residential scale to community scale, battery storage systems, microgrids for energy resilience and climate resilience, transmission and interconnection upgrades, energy efficiency retrofits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those projects that were moving forward are now paused, and the capital stacks that were structured carefully now have a giant gap to fill where the federal dollars once were. So the frustration and the disappointment is real, but the action is the best antidote, we feel, to frustration and those feelings of hopelessness that many who are listening, I'm sure, have felt about not only the energy rescindment of funds, but all of it that Rob was discussing. And we like to focus on the work that we're doing with tribal leaders and members to project progress and keep the self-determined quest for tribal energy sovereignty moving forward. I'd love to address with some real numbers about what we experienced with some of those federal clawbacks, if I may.
Yes, please do.
So the Alliance, we don't run on federal funding or public funding of any kind. We run 100% on philanthropy, but we have a whole department committed to working with tribes to write federal grants. And so during the Biden era, our team worked with tribes to submit $891 million in clean energy funding proposals on behalf of tribal nations. We successfully secured more than $476 million in awards across about 50 tribes. And that represented 250 plus megawatts of solar, 25 megawatts of storage, and over 32 miles of transmission lines and substation infrastructure. So those awards represented community-owned assets that were going to generate long-term revenue and stabilize energy costs and create jobs, et cetera. All but a very tiny percentage of that funding that was spent has been clawed back.
Okay. Over $4 million in awards, 50 tribes. What's the status of these projects now?
$476 million in awards.
Over 400 million.
Yes.
I'm sorry, 470
yes.
million plus. Thank you for the
yes.
clarification. Sorry.
Yes.
So what's the status? What's happening?
Well, there's litigation that many tribes are engaged in right now with the support of legal partners, and these programs weren't abstract climate funding. They weren't all of them utility scale. They were the backbone of financing for things like Solar for All and the electrification of homes for families who've never had electricity, still in the 21st century. The utility scale projects that were opening the door to tribes being able to participate in wholesale energy markets for the first time as a means to replace economies and revenues lost when coal plants or coal mines are shut down, for example, which Chairman Navanyama can certainly speak to that. So tribes, as Rob explained, were on track to receive about $3.5 billion across these climate and clean energy categories combined. And with all of that rescinded and only a portion of it deployed, it means fewer megawatts built, fewer transmission lines upgraded, fewer microgrids installed. And it's about these projects that were designed and engineered, in some case ready to break ground. So it's disrupted real projects, the clawbacks, and many of our listeners had solar farms and microgrids and all kinds of developments planned. And these financing gaps are now widened. Contractors hesitate. The timelines are now shot. community expectations are strained and people are frustrated, and it's once again being let down by our federal government. But we're looking at this moment, and we're actively supporting over 140 tribes at this moment, and collectively we're looking at it as a time to structurally reset. And we have our Indigenous Power and Light Fund for Energy Sovereignty, for example. Originally, it was a fund, a $100 million fund designed to fill the gaps that federal funding never covered. And even under IRA, federal programs didn't pay for everything. They rarely covered full pre-development costs. They still had match requirements. They didn't absorb early stage risk. So the fund was established to close those gaps so projects could move from conception to construction without surrendering ownership or control. But when the clawbacks came, we had to pivot, right? So with the support of the philanthropic partners that seeded the fund, we are now triaging projects. We're focusing on those that only needed a remaining infusion of cash to move to construction, or those that are life-critical projects that can be fully funded. So instead of only filling these predictable funding gaps, the fund is now being used to stabilize projects that were disrupted. And so there are tribes still moving forward with the support of us and others that are making philanthropic grants and braiding and weaving capital together. And that's what we're focused on. Our Weaver platform, that is an amazing modeling tool that is available to tribes at no cost, that is helping us to braid philanthropic capital, mission-aligned private investment, state programs, tax credit mechanisms, community development finance, CDFIs, and tribal investment together. And so while historically we've had to rely heavily on a single federal funding stream, that concentration of risk is what we're now working to reduce so that some of these projects that were stalled can still move forward. So,
and Sherry, these non-federal funding opportunities or sources that you just mentioned, philanthropy being one of them, are they enough potentially to make up this shortfall without the federal dollars? Or is there any sense maybe that at some point federal funding for these projects could return?
Well, there definitely is a sense that the pendulum of them will swing the other way, and eventually we'll have, what we all feel in this conversation, I'm sure, as restitution, as what tribes are due. But until then, yes, there still is an opportunity to get these projects done. Can philanthropy fill the gaps that that the Fed left? No, absolutely not. I think there was a study done that said all the philanthropy in the world could only make up 9% of that federal funding that was rescinded. So now we're working with tribal governments to build that capital stack with other forms of investment, private, public, and what little public is left, and mission-aligned investment. We're really working hard now with tribal governments to maintain site controls, to preserve the engineering and the permitting that was done already, to protect previously secured private capital and keep the development agreements intact, so that when the policy conditions shift again, the tribes that have maintained project readiness will be positioned to move immediately. So, energy sovereignty requires patience and long-term strategy. We know that, but, this was a setback that we won't say we were surprised by it, but it certainly was a blow. But we continue to move forward in many ways.
Sherry, what the federal government is investing in right now, are there any opportunities you see for tribes?
Yes, there are, and I think, as Rob was saying before, that a lot of the investment was that came from IRA wasn't necessarily earmarked for tribes. Solar for All had 6 tribal consortia that received funding that was earmarked specifically for tribes, thanks to the efforts of our dear friend Pilar Thomas, who and others who fought to even get that. They weren't going to give any. There was tribal specific money in there, but in any political environment, we encourage tribes and we support tribes in looking for other sources that are still available that can be applied to tribal projects. We have to be honest, right now there's not a ton of opportunity or any for federal dollars that can be used for solar or wind, but there is some still for geothermal, for certain hydro projects, and certainly, we're exploring all of those avenues, and our grants team can help tribes look at what their energy plans are, to do energy plans that can capitalize on what is available and braid it along with those other sources.
Thank you, Sherry. Let's get a community perspective now and learn a little bit more about some of these projects that have been impacted. And to do that, we have our next guest, Timothy Nuvang-Yoma, on the show. He is a former chairman of the Hopi Tribe and also vice president of tribal engagement for the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. And Tim, Hopi Tribe, your people plan to install solar panels through the Solar for All program. Tell us more about this proposed project and how it's been impacted.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for asking that question. One of the biggest and notable impacts was to our Solar for All project. We had received an award, the Hopi Tribe, for $25 million to install rooftop solar on quite a bit of homes. And our Hopi Utilities Corporation was able to do some studies along with some of our partners at ASU. And so they identified approximately 900 or so homes that didn't have electricity, and about 600 homes should have received solar and battery systems, mainly for off-grid homes. And that construction was slated to have started in January after a year's worth of planning. So after, and I'm just going to refer to it as the Triple B, after that was passed, we all know that the EPA terminated that funding, which meant the loss of that project. And part of the hardest thing as a chairman to have to deliver is news that goes against the hopes of a lot of these families living in these homes that is no longer a possibility, and that's what we had to do. So in relation to that, that was a big hit to the Hopi Tribe and those families that were expecting it.
I imagine some of these families perhaps were living off the grid, and this would have enabled them to have power in their homes?
For the first time. And I should mention that, having to get our, community, much like other tribal communities in the world past COVID, it really exacerbated a lot of the needs in some of these multi-generational homes even. And with some of those that are medically reliant on the equipment, it makes it very difficult, even for education, to simply charge a cell phone or, a laptop to make sure you're maintaining that. Is everything that it went away in the hopes that they could, empower themselves and enrich, what most of the world has as a convenience, much of those, off reservation.
Tim, this discussion today, it really does beg the question, how feasible is it now for tribes to continue to focus on green energy today and for the future when we're looking at this complete about-face on clean energy and climate change policy and funding at the federal level? What does the future really hold here?
Oh gosh, I'm worried, concerned. I look back at First Nations and the fact that I feel that First Nations were the original scientists and knew about our world and the covenant that Hopi has, much of our relatives across Turtle Island, is to protect the natural resources we have, and we have been stewarding that relationship with Mother Earth, since we were blessed with this world that we live on. So I found it quite, heartwarming that renewables was the answer to a lot of what we're experiencing today in the form of climate change, and I really appreciate Robert touching base on that earlier. And so it's our responsibility to look at what's happening across the world in our country today with, the storms that are more active in different ways than they have been, the droughts, the severe impacts of the weathers. We see it happening on a regular basis. Out here on Hopi, we're dry farmers, and we don't see the monsoons come in regular cycles like they normally would. The rain that we got last year was because of the hurricane that was off on the West Coast, which is, it's unnatural. And there's a lot of unnatural things happening in this world today, and, we need to begin the healing somewhere, and this is part of that healing, was looking at ways that communities could not only bring some benefits under renewables to their communities, but a way that we could continue that stewardship with Mother Earth.
Tim, we heard Sherry talk earlier about opportunities, though, that do exist with regard to where the federal government is investing money. Do you see any opportunities for the Hopi tribe with regard to some of these other funding priorities at present?
I would. Everything requires planning, and I think for us, the Hopi tribe, like all our relatives, we're resilient, and there's, solutions with every problem that you have. Even in the darkest place, you look for that little glimmer of light that, we can expose and look at that as a saving grace to try to bring those positive impacts back. And so for the Hopi tribe, I'm always going to be hopeful that there is a path forward into, finding creative solutions. But those creative solutions really, help when you have resources out there that are willing to offer and extend some of the subject matter experience that we were able to receive from the Alliance when I was, the chairman of the Hopi tribe. So I'm always going to remain hopeful that there will be a shift and that we'll be able to see, a part of that move into a healing process for the Hopi tribe.
Well, you mentioned planning, Tim, and how long does it take to plan for a project of this scale? And then when funding just shifts like this, I imagine it could be years before you could get something else feasible that could take its place.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, when the Triple B got passed, it was like we took a hit to the chin. And, Sherry mentioned the Hopi tribe and some of the other communities being coal impacted, and that's exactly where we're at. The Hopi tribe is a coal impacted community, so, this was a way that the Hopi tribe could exercise its energy sovereignty and provide a stable electrical infrastructure, but it also serves as a catalyst to spur economic development and jobs. With the closure of the Navajo generating station, it resulted in a loss of upwards to 85% of the tribe's general fund budget. And even in our area, with APS being the only electrical provider for our region, they even decommissioned the Choya power plant, which put another strain on that energy infrastructure. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is definitely, a lot of working parts here. We'll be right back.
Support by the Gathering of Nations Powwow. The last dance is this April 24th and 25th at Expo, New Mexico. Gone's last horse rider and regalia parade takes place at 4 p.m. both days. Tickets at gatheringofnations.com and at the gates.
Kaufman & Associates is a Native-owned and led consulting firm supporting Native communities with culturally grounded solutions to shape Indigenous futures. More at kaufmaninc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
This is Native America Calling. We're going to spend the rest of the hour now talking about the country's power to understand and influence the health and infrastructure impacts of climate change. The Trump administration just rescinded a landmark policy from 2009. Let's get some calls going here. Anyone who has any thoughts with regard to climate change or maybe clean energy projects in your community you'd like to tie into today's discussion, we're at 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. The EPA just rescinded what's referred to as the endangerment findings, a scientific conclusion and government declaration on the dangerous impacts of greenhouse gas emissions on public health. That action effectively erases nearly 2 decades of federal policies and regulations going forward aimed at tackling and slowing climate change. To help us better understand this issue, we're now joined by Dr. Kyle White, a professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And Kyle, what exactly are the endangerment findings and when were they written into federal policy? Let's start there.
Yeah, I appreciate your taking up this topic, Sean. And in 2009, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, had decided that it was responsible for lessening the types of pollution that contribute to climate change. So basically the idea is that the U.S. government reviewed what at that time was years of scientific research that shows that when you release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the main one being carbon dioxide, which gets released when you burn coal and gas and oil, that goes up into the atmosphere and it creates a warming effect. That warming effect destabilizes the climate system, so that what happens is that not only do a lot of places get warmer over time, but storms become worse, things become less predictable, exactly what many of the guests were describing. And so in 2009, actually, EPA said the Clean Air Act requires EPA to take actions to reduce carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And it mainly was referring to cars, to the emissions from cars. However, the fact that they were saying that scientifically we know that these gases are bad, it led to an effect that justified many other programs, including what a lot of the guests were talking about.
Since 2009 and the declaration, the endangerment findings, has there been an impact, a significant impact as a result? And if so, how are you able to track any data like that?
Well, absolutely. One of the hidden stories was how, going back to the 1990s, and some would say before, tribal people, Native people in the U.S., have played a huge role in science, showing that climate change is not just something that is going to affect us years from now, but actually Native communities are being affected right now by climate change. And so what basically happened was that, you have the endangerment finding, but then you have decades of articles of research of, Native people being involved in influential reports like the National Climate Assessment, tribal leaders going to Congress, and many other efforts that actually showed that tribal people's ways of life right now, tribal health, tribal economies, tribal subsistence, are all being affected by climate change. And so a lot of the federal programs that were developed to support the ability of tribes to adapt to climate change, to mitigate some of the causes like carbon dioxide of climate change, those were justified by the immediacy of both the science that said that, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases contribute to climate change, but also the research that tribes had been working very hard to show that Native people are impacted right away by many of these climate change effects.
And Cal, you mentioned some of these health ramifications. What specifically, what types of diseases or what types of conditions could either be made worse or introduced because of some of these issues with regard to the air we breathe?
Absolutely. This is one of the things that's extremely upsetting, and there's a lack of data, but even based on what we know and what Native people from communities can testify to, it's extremely upsetting what's happening. So with regard to health, there's a couple of different ways to look at it, and again, all of which is really disturbing for Native people. So on the one hand, and this is something that a lot of folks often don't know about, but when the climate warms, even if you don't kind of detect the warming in your everyday life, if you're living in a community that's already experiencing higher air pollution, whether you're indoor air pollution or like the ambient or outdoor air pollution, that warming creates stagnant air, and it actually, in a lot of different ways, makes that air pollution worse. And so we've actually seen that for some tribal communities, their air pollution is becoming worse. Now, what does that mean? Well, that can do things from increasing rates of asthma to even like heart disease, as well as increasing bronchitis and other types of sickness that can really take you out and affect your work and your ability to play the different roles that people play. And so there's this air pollution aspect of it, but then there's a whole other host of just upsetting health concerns. For example, the destabilization of the climate system, like our colleague was talking about, it not only threatens tribal agriculture, but tribal subsistence. And for a lot of tribal communities, subsistence crops like wild rice or other plants are very sensitive to climate change. And so if you lose access to them, right, because of flooding or because the habitat becomes so destabilized, then you're losing that source of nutrition. And for a lot of tribes where subsistence diets are some of the healthiest diets that folks can access, that's a huge hit to your health. But then there's this whole other dimension about how when you're in a community that has already been ignored by the U.S. for years regarding infrastructure upgrades, and, climate change makes precipitation events more extreme, makes floods more extreme. And if all of a sudden you get hit hard by a flooding event, that can do things from increasing mold to causing other stress in your life. And so, we're seeing communities then just grapple with having to get hit harder and harder. And then there are literally tribal communities that because of climate change, they're having to permanently relocate. They're having to move from one location to the other. We know historically all over the world that every time a community has to do that, they're going to be worse off economically and health-wise. So that the U.S. has now literally said that it's not going to regulate the effects of greenhouse gases is just disturbing.
Kyle, to hear you describe it, I'm just thinking of our listeners right now, and a lot of them, their ears are really perking up here. And we've covered some of these topics, like in Alaska, for example, communities having to relocate because of impacts of climate change.
Right.
Let's go back now to this whole issue with these endangerment findings and this rescission. What do you see as the immediate impact right now with regard to tribes in terms of funding, in terms of policy, and other areas?
The immediate impact is that you had tribes that were moving forward, whether with government funding or with the intent that there could be government funding in the future to regulate the greenhouse gas emissions in their communities. And so tribes are doing this a host of ways. Some guests talked about tribes that are trying to get out of the fossil fuel energy business, like coal plants. You had other tribes that they were improving their automobile fleets, to reduce their air pollution burden. You had tribes that were inventorying all the greenhouse gases that their buildings and businesses are producing and taking measures to lower that. And you actually had tribal entrepreneurs that were finding business opportunities in renewable energy and infrastructure changes, even in carbon removal and some other technologies that can lower air pollution. And so the wind has been sucked out of that completely. And so, and there's no way to figure out what it will take to get the federal government to take this seriously again. And like some of the guests were talking about already, because of how tribal communities have been ignored, having the federal government backing something also opens up opportunities for business, for philanthropy, for others to jump in. And so, again, not to put any tribes on the spot, but so many tribes that I connect with in my work, it's literally like they just got punched in the stomach and they don't know what the future of their efforts are to improve both the air quality, but also to reduce their dependence on fossil fuel energy and their burning of carbon dioxide.
Thank you, Kyle. Let's bring Robert Maxim back into the conversation. He is with the Brookings Institution. And Robert, your research mentioned an increased need for tribes with regard to alternative sources of energy because of federal divestment and resource extraction. Tell us more what you mean by that and what our listeners really need to understand from this show and from this issue today.
Yeah, one of the challenges is that the federal government, in the way it thinks about its obligations to Indian country, are really incomplete. And so the way that the federal government, in many instances, talks about the trust and treaty obligation right now really is around things like, uh, trust land, certain payments, and then limited benefits. And I think SNAP and Medicaid, for example, are two of those. But if you take a step back and you read some of the federal government's own work, and I like pointing to, the Senate's American Indian Policy Committee report that came out in the 1970s. And they talk about the trust obligation encompassing any investment, economic or social, that's needed to ensure that the standard of living in Indian country meets that of the general population. And so if we're holding the federal government to that standard, which again is their own words, right? Uh, what that says is not only is this type of climate investment, which the scientific consensus by far shows is necessary to ensure the health and living standards of Native people meet that of the U.S. general population. Not only is that central to these investments, but also the level of investment into Indian country has been wholly inadequate in this space and in others. And that counts not only with climate, but also with health investment, with things like nutrition assistance. And so, what we see, actually, we have some forthcoming work coming out about this, is that historically, the federal government has underinvested in Indian country. The time it kind of came the closest to meeting almost its full trust and treaty obligations was in that immediate post-pandemic period. And you see not only a massive increase in federal spending, but also a massive increase in spending in Indian country. But something has happened since then. In the following years, federal spending as a whole, at least through 2024, remained elevated. I think, when new future data comes out, we'll see that change in 2025. But federal funding for Indian country actually receded almost back to its pre-pandemic norms. Mm-hmm. And so, as I mentioned earlier, that level of investment has been wholly inadequate over time. And that's why you see many of the not only climate challenges, but economic and social challenges that, that my fellow panel mates have been discussing throughout the conversation.
All right, Robert, thank you. Kyle, I want to go back to you. We've got a couple of minutes before we have to wrap up, so I'm going to give you the last word. But today, much of our focus has been on how these policy changes, the removal of funding impacts tribal nations and governments. But what about just regular Native people? Somebody who might be listening to the show right now, and maybe for the last few years they've been thinking about adding some solar panels to their roof, or maybe they've been debating about finally taking the plunge and getting rid of an internal combustion engine vehicle and buying an EV. And now they're hearing about all these changes, huge changes with regard to policy. What do you tell that person?
So I would remind, any Native person to just remember our history as some of the most incredible advocates for policy change on climate. The reason why there are so many of these programs was because Native people, again, going back many decades, a lot of people don't remember this, were pushing for policies that would make it so the federal government, philanthropy, and others would take measures to support tribally led climate and energy issues that matter to individual Native people that realize that their health is in peril, that realize that, certain types of clean cars are not affordable. And for a lot of us, our tribal governments need to have access to these programs so that the benefits trickle down to us. So what I would tell anybody in Indian country is that it's time for us to get back into this, pushing our tribal leaders, our elected officials to be advocating for these things in Washington, writing letters, showing up to consultations, being part of policy discussions, supporting organizations like the National Tribal Air Association, which represents like 150 or 160, I think, tribes that have air quality programs. So we need to go back to what we were doing when we were having congressional hearings on climate change, when we were going to the media, and that we were really showing how hard we were getting hit, whether it's from the forest fires or, coastal erosion. And so it's time for us to be energized again as these programs are now being, pulled out from us. And to really remember and to study, to study that history. And all of this, Sean, was done in the dark. The reason why the endangerment finding was taken away was because the administration violated all of its the government's advisory rules and did like a secret scientific report, scientific loosely used, right? And so it was all done in the dark. Yet tribes have been over time, at the forefront and public about their concerns. And so we need to get back to doing that again in order to create a new movement to protect our health, our well-being, and our economies.
All right. And with that, we are out of time. So I want to thank our guests today, Dr. Kyle White, Robert Maxim, Sherry Smith, and Timothy Nuvung-Yoma. Please, listeners, tune in again tomorrow. We'll have a discussion about new regulations for commercial fishers in Alaska in reaction to dwindling salmon populations. I'm Sean Spruce. Enjoy the rest of your day.
The faculty of tribal colleges and universities support their students in countless ways. They say I believe and offer help before it's asked.
Hear that?
Fully embrace.
That's everything tribal college faculty do for their students on Fast Forward. Because if one tried to say it in real time, they'd be here all day. They teach, guide, comfort, and connect. And for that, the community is grateful. Learn more at mostthoroughdjobdescription.com. The American Indian College Fund supports this program.
They give extensions, share progress, share laughter, create calm, and allow reflection. They inspire hope, share wisdom, guide gently, validate feelings.
Who protects Indian country? Ameren does. As the only 100% tribally owned insurance carrier, Ameren helps strengthen tribal communities by providing reliable insurance coverage and keeping dollars in Indian country. From property and liability to commercial auto and tribal workers' compensation, Ameren is here to protect what matters. Celebrating 40 years of serving Indian country. Learn more at Ameren.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Quantic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
The 30th Annual Alaska Native Art Auction, celebrating Indigenous artists and voices, takes place Saturday, March 21st. Corporate sponsorship opportunities are available. Information at kmba.org.